The gavel was made of polished oak, but it sounded like a spade striking hard winter ground. Crack. Going once. The auctioneer, a man named Peters, barked, his voice straining to be heard over the rising scream of the wind. The air in the barn was thick with the smell of wet wool, stale coffee, and the metallic tang of fear. It was packed. The entire town of Redemption Creek had turned out, not in support, but for the spectacle. Their faces pale and judgmental in the sickly yellow light of the hanging work lamps. Crack. Going twice. Sarah Jenkins stood by a rotted support beam, her hands clenched so tightly her fingernails were white. She couldn't feel the cold, but she could see her breath. A small, white cloud of failure, dissipating into the gloom. 58 years old. A widow. A pariah, and now about to be homeless. Sold, the auctioneer would say. And the gavel would fall, not just on the farm, but on the last 100 years of her family's name. At the front, sitting on a hay bale, like a king on a throne, Owen Blackwood smiled. He was a thick redwood of a man, his wealth radiating from him like a furnace. He hadn't even bid. He didn't need to. He had arranged the whole thing. He owned the debt. This was just a formality. The wind howled, rattling the tin roof of the barn like a prisoner shaking the bars. The storm, the one they'd been warning about for 3 days, was almost here. A perfect backdrop for a funeral. And for the final time. Peters raised the gavel. This was it. Stop. The word was not a shout. It was quiet, like a stone dropped into a deep well. Yet it cut through the noise of the wind and the crowd. It came from the man standing next to Sarah, a man nobody had bothered to look at twice, a man they had all dismissed for 20 years. Eli Thorne, the town failure, the eccentric carpenter, took one step forward. Stop the auction. The gavel paused, hovering in the air. Owen Blackwood's smile twitched. On what grounds, Eli? Peters sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. You got a pocket full of cash you've been hiding, you old ghost. The crowd chuckled, a low, cruel sound. No, Eli said, his voice steady. He reached into the pocket of his worn canvas jacket. I don't have cash. I have evidence. This isn't an auction. It's the scene of a crime. It had all started 3 weeks earlier, with the sound of a different kind of ending, the hydraulic sigh of a bus door opening onto a rain-slicked street. Sarah Jenkins stepped off the Greyhound bus from Chicago, pulling the collar of her thin city coat tighter. She had left Redemption Creek 25 years ago. The bright, ambitious daughter who was going to conquer the world. She had married Robert Jenkins, a charismatic, fast-rising banker. They had a high-rise condo, European vacations, and a life that was a glittering mirage. Then Robert had died, a single car crash on a clear night, and the mirage evaporated. The bankers, Robert's friends, had come, their faces masks of polite regret. Irregularities, they'd said. A leveraged portfolio. Embezzlement. The words were sterile, clinical daggers. He had lost everything. Their money. His client's money. He had died a thief, leaving Sarah with nothing but his shame and a one-way bus ticket back to the only thing she had left in the world. Her parents' farm. The town of Redemption Creek had not welcomed her back with open arms. They watched her from behind curtains, from the cabs of their pickup trucks. They saw her failure as a judgment on her ambition, a vindication of their own quiet lives. She was the prodigal daughter, returned with no fatted calf, only a suitcase full of disgrace. The farm was worse than she remembered. It was not resting, it was dying. The paint was gone, peeled back by decades of harsh winters, leaving the wood siding gray and vulnerable. The fields were fallow, choked with weeds. The barn, her father's pride, listed to one side. Nailed to the front door, stark white against the rotting wood, was the foreclosure notice. It wasn't the bank. The loan, she discovered with a cold, sickening lurch, was private. Her husband, Robert, in a desperate, secret bid to cover his losses in Chicago, had leveraged the farm. He had, in his final, catastrophic act of failure, given their ancestral home to the one man who had always wanted to destroy it. The auction was set. In 2 weeks. Just before the biggest storm of the season was predicted to hit. Sarah was utterly, profoundly alone. She spent her days in a fog, walking through the cold, silent house. It was a museum of her past, of a life she had fled, and in the center of her father's study, covered in a dusty sheet, was the one thing of value she had left. His hand-carved oak desk. It was the last piece of her father she had. She wouldn't let Blackwood have it. She wouldn't let it be sold for pennies, pawed at by strangers. But a hinge was broken, and one of the drawers was jammed, locked tight for as long as she could remember. She needed it fixed, just to salvage this one last piece of dignity. She had no money. Not $1. She asked around. The only name that came up, the only person who might work for nothing, was Elias Thorne. She remembered him. She remembered him. A quiet, strange man who had always been on the periphery. He lived in a small workshop outside town. A carpenter who, the story said, took 3 days to fix a chair. He was the town eccentric, its ghost. He was, she realized, just like her, an outcast. She found him in his workshop, a place that smelled of cedar shavings and old varnish. It was, to her surprise, meticulously organized. Tools hung in perfect, shadowed outlines. Eli was 60, tall but stooped, as if carrying an invisible weight. His face was a roadmap of deep lines, his gray eyes quiet and assessing. Just a profound, bottomless weariness. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her city voice sounding too loud, too brittle in the quiet space. "Eli, just Eli," he said. His voice was a low rumble. I have a desk, my father's. The drawer is stuck. I can't pay, not with money, but the larder is still half full. I can cook a hot meal for a week." Her voice broke on the last word, the humiliation of it burning her throat. Eli looked at her for a long time. He had known her father, John. They had been friends, once. He had promised John years ago that he would keep an eye on the place if Sarah ever came home. "I'll be by this afternoon," he said, turning back to his lathe. "Leave the door unlocked." He arrived late that afternoon, carrying a worn leather satchel of tools. He didn't use a truck. He walked, his tall frame cutting a lonely figure against the bruised purple sky. He had been at the farm for less than an hour when the trucks pulled up. It was a delegation. Mrs. Gable, the town's self-appointed moral authority, and 2 other farmers, men who worked land leased from Blackwood. Sarah. Mrs. Gable called, her voice sharp and carrying on the wind. "We've come to talk some sense into you." Sarah stepped onto the porch, Eli silent in the doorway behind her. "It's about him," Gable said, nodding at Eli with open disgust. "You don't want him in your house, Sarah. He's bad luck." "What are you talking about?" "The Millers." The woman snapped, as if it were obvious. 20 years ago, they lost their farm. He was helping them. Went to the bank, said he'd sort their books. Next thing you know, the bank foreclosed. He's a jinx, a failure. You let him touch your father's things, you'll lose this farm just like they did. It was a cruel, perfectly aimed blow, designed to isolate her completely. Sarah looked at the hard, unforgiving faces of her old community. Then she looked at Eli. He was staring at the ground, his face pale, his shoulders hunched. He was reliving it, the Miller's folly. It was his shame. It was why he had come back. Sarah, who had been judged by boardrooms, by society wives, and now by the town she once called home, felt something snap. "Mrs. Gable," Sarah said, her voice dropping to that same icy calm she'd used on her husband's bankers. "This is my property. At least, it is for another week. Get off it, now." The delegation sputtered, stunned by the venom. They left, their truck spitting gravel. He hadn't moved. "Is it true?" she asked. He nodded, his eyes still on the floorboards. I made a mistake. I missed a decimal. I trusted a document that I shouldn't have. I cost them everything. And you've been paying for it ever since," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. He looked up, his weary eyes meeting hers. "I'll get to work on that desk, Sarah." For 3 days, Eli worked in the cold study. He and Sarah ate in near silence, 2 ghosts sharing canned soup and stale bread. The wind howled, a constant, low-level scream. The storm was getting closer. On the 3rd day, Eli called for her. "The drawer," he said. It wasn't just stuck. It was locked. From the inside, he had finally, gently, worked it open. "There's a false back, Sarah." He pulled out the drawer and laid it on the floor, with a thin, specialized tool. He pressed a spot on the wood. A hidden panel clicked open. Twist 2. Inside was a small, oilcloth-wrapped package. Sarah's hand trembled as she took it. It was heavy. She unwrapped it on the desk. Inside were 2 items. The first was an old, leather-bound farm ledger. The date on the first page was 1978. "That's my grandfather's," she whispered. Eli, his hands suddenly precise and quick, opened it. His eyes, no longer weary but sharp, scanned the pages. They were filled with notations, numbers, and maps. "Sarah," he said, his voice tense, "what do you know about the creek that's supposed to run along your northern border?" "Nothing. It's just a dry gulch. Has been for my whole life." "It wasn't always," Eli said. He pointed to the ledger. "Look, your grandfather's logs, water tables, flow rates, and this." He pointed to a page from 1981. A notation. "Blackwood's new dam. The creek is gone. John, you must fight this." It was signed by his father. Blackwood's father. Eli whispered, the pieces clicking into place with an audible snap. "He built an illegal dam 40 years ago. He diverted the headwaters of the creek onto his own property. He stole your water, Sarah. That's why this farm failed, not your father's management. It was theft. From the beginning, Twist 3, Part 1. But that's 40 years ago." Sarah stammered. "It won't stop the auction." "No," Eli said, his eyes fixed on the second item from the package. It was a newer envelope, sealed, addressed to Sarah. In her husband's handwriting, she tore it open. Inside was not a letter. It was a single sheet of paper, a legal pad, written in a different, frantic hand. It began, "I, Daniel Blackwood, do hereby confess." "Daniel," Sarah breathed. "Blackwood's son, the one who ran off years ago." They read it together, their horror growing. It was a full confession. How his father, Owen, had preyed on Robert's, Sarah's husband's, financial troubles. How he had offered the predatory loan, knowing Robert was desperate. How he'd planned to seize the farm all along, to finish what his father started. It was a detailed, sickening account of fraud and blackmail. Twist 3, Part 2, and tucked inside the folded paper, one more thing. A small, cheap, plastic burner phone. Eli, his hands now steady, pressed the power button. It was nearly dead, but it lit up. 1 bar. There was one message thread. The last text, sent from this phone, was to a single contact. O. B. Eli read it aloud, his voice barely a whisper. I have your son's confession, Owen. I'm not letting you do this to my wife's family. Meet me at the Old Mill Bridge. Tonight, we end this. The date on the text was the night Robert died, the night of his accident. Twist 4. Sarah collapsed into the chair. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a scandal. It was murder. Her husband, the man she'd thought a failure and a thief, had been trying to protect her. He had died trying to do the right thing. "My God," she whispered. "My God, Eli." Eli stood up. The stoop was gone. His eyes, which had been weary and haunted for 20 years, were now clear. They were the eyes of a man who had just been given a purpose. "Sarah," he said, "the auction is tomorrow. I think it's time we went," which brought them back to the barn. The auctioneer, Peters, held the gavel high, frozen by Eli's command. "I said, 'Stop the auction,'" Eli repeated, his voice now ringing with an authority no one in the room had ever heard from him. "On what grounds, Eli?" Owen Blackwood demanded. His voice a low growl. He was on his feet now, his smile gone. "On the grounds of 40 years of systematic fraud," Eli said. He held up the old ledger. "This is John Jenkins' ledger. It proves your father, in 1981, illegally diverted the creek that fed this farm, starving it of water. A crime you knowingly perpetuated." A gasp went through the crowd. Blackwood laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound. That's your proof? A 40-year-old fairy tale? You old fool." He snapped his fingers. His lawyer, a slick man from the city, stepped forward and handed him a file. "This," Blackwood said, throwing the file on the auctioneer's table, "is a certified geological survey, dated 2 months ago, proving there is no subterranean headwater on my property. It's a dry bed. Always has been." Twist 5. The false defeat. "And this," Blackwood continued, holding up a second file, "is a legally executed, ironclad loan document, signed by Robert Jenkins. Witnessed. Notarized. The debt is real. The farm is mine." He nodded to Peters. "End this. Sell the property." The crowd deflated. They looked at Eli with pity. The failure had tried. The sheriff, who had been leaning against a post, shrugged. "It's a civil matter, Eli. The man's got the paperwork. My hands are tied." Peters raised the gavel. "Bud, going." "Wait." Eli's voice was like iron. "You're right, Owen. The survey is a lie, but it's a legal lie. The loan is real. But let's talk about why the loan exists." Eli Thorne straightened to his full height. He looked, for a moment, like a prophet in the storm. "My name," he said, his voice filling the barn, "is Elias Thorne. For 20 years, you've known me as your local carpenter. A failure, a jinx. What you don't know," he said, his eyes locking on the sheriff, "is that before I came here, I was a senior forensic accountant for the Department of Justice." A stunned, absolute silence fell over the barn. "I came back here in shame," Eli continued, his voice thick with 20 years of guilt. "Because I made a mistake. I missed a decimal. I trusted a forged document, right here in this county. And I cost the Miller family their farm. I have lived with that failure every single day." He turned to Blackwood, his face a mask of cold justice. "I will not make that mistake again." Twist 6. The real climax. The 40-year-old ledger is just history. He held up the single sheet of legal paper. "This," he said, "is a handwritten, signed confession. From your son, Daniel, detailing the conspiracy to commit fraud, the predatory nature of the loan, and the blackmail you used to trap Robert Jenkins." Blackwood's face turned the color of ash. "Lies, forgery. You. Failure." "Is it?" Eli said. He held up the burner phone. Perhaps you can explain this text message. Sent to you by Robert Jenkins on the night he died. The night he was supposed to meet you at the Old Mill Bridge. The night his car accidentally went into the ravine. He read the text aloud. I have your son's confession, Owen. Meet me at the Old Mill Bridge. Tonight. We end this. Eli lowered the phone and looked at the sheriff, who was no longer leaning. That, sheriff, Eli said, his voice quiet but deadly, is not a civil matter. That is fraud, extortion, and motive for murder. And I am your expert witness. Now, are you going to stop this auction? Or do I need to call the state police and report a conspiracy? For a moment, the only sound was the shriek of the wind. The sheriff, his face grim, snapped the cuffs onto a stunned, sputtering Owen Blackwood. Owen Blackwood, you're under arrest. For all of it. It clattered to the floor, unsold. The auction dissolved into chaos. As Blackwood was led away, the townspeople, their faces a mixture of shock, guilt, and dawning understanding, looked at Sarah and Eli. And then, the storm hit. The first gust of wind tore the great barn door off one of its hinges. Rain, driven like needles, blasted into the opening. The crowd began to panic, running for their trucks. Sarah and Eli were left standing alone, watching the storm try to tear down what was, impossibly, still theirs. They were alone for only a minute. The first to return was the grandson of the Miller family, the ones Eli had failed 20 years ago. He was holding a hammer. That roof ain't gonna hold, he said, not looking at Eli, but not looking away either. Then, another truck, and another. Mrs. Gable, her face pale but resolute, emerged carrying a heavy thermos. We've got boards in the truck. The wind's coming from the west. Within 15 minutes, the entire town was there. Not as spectators, but as neighbors. They worked for hours, shouting over the roar of the wind, boarding up windows, bracing the barn door, securing the roof. They formed a human chain to move sandbags. They were saving the farm. They were saving their farm. As dawn broke, the storm passed, leaving a scrubbed, clean, and broken world behind. The farm was battered, but it was standing. Sarah and Eli stood on the front porch, wrapped in old blankets, drinking hot coffee from Mrs. Gable's thermos. The town was gone, their work done. So, Sarah said, looking at the man beside her. A forensic accountant. Eli smiled, a real, unrestrained smile that took 20 years off his face. Retired. I prefer working with wood. It's more honest. You saved my home, Eli. You saved my husband's name. We saved each other, Sarah, he said. He looked out over the muddy fields, where the first hint of sun was breaking through the clouds. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. Eli said, with that water source, this land is still good. It'll be hard work, but it's good. Sarah looked at the land, not as a prison, but as a promise. Yes, she said, sipping her coffee. It is. But I'm going to need some help fixing the place up. I hear there's a good carpenter in town. Eli looked at her, and for the first time in 20 years, his future felt as solid and real as the oak desk his hands had restored. I think, he said, I can make some time.
If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to support the channel so we can create more videos. Thank you, everyone.